discovered the power to harness and use fire, we were involved in agrarian activities. That is, taking the seeds of plants and then replanting them to produce more. The very foundation of our modern civilization and human culture is centered around the planting and cultivation of edible plants.
Here are some of the amazing deals at INFOWARS Seed Center at INFOWARSshop.com.
The Survival Seed Vault by My Patriot Supply features only the finest survival heirloom seeds for a robust and hardy garden, even in the toughest times. We also have starter varieties of the deluxe seed packages for fruit, salad, salsa, peppers, medical herbs, and more.
Go to the INFOWARS Seed Center at INFOWARSshop.com.
And remember, the revolution against tyranny is growing.
Have you ever wondered how closely vaccines are tied into autism? We hear the statistics, we hear the CDC numbers, we hear other people's numbers, but have you really researched it to know for sure? Or Dr. Brian Hooker has. He's from Simpson University, and he's going to tell us all of his research right now. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Hooker.
Well, thank you for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
Yes, we definitely appreciate you coming on. So can you tell us a little bit about your experience, and then after that, tell us what interests you the most about looking into autism and vaccines?
Well, my PhD is in biochemical engineering, and I've done a lot of work in assessing science. I've had quite a varied career. I've done work in molecular genetics for plants, done work in environmental cleanup, but I've also done a lot of statistics and, as of late, epidemiology. So I'm looking at specifically what's happening and what's causing the autism epidemic.
Exactly. Now let's go into one of your more recent articles. We have this article, Vaccine Industry Watchdog Obtains CDC Documents. Can you tell us a little bit about this document and what you found in your findings?
Sure. Just to back up a little bit, I got involved in this whole movement in 2002, and because I have a child who was injured by his infant vaccines and has developed, he's 16 now, he's developed some neurological issues and, struggles on a daily basis. And we, when he got vaccinated and when he started to show symptoms, it was very, very obvious to us that there was some problem and the two were connected.
Well, sir, if you don't mind me asking, could you tell us what type of problems he had?
Well, he has severe language delays. He essentially doesn't have any language, and experiences a lot of pain. He has been diagnosed with autism. I don't like to use autism as a diagnosis because there are so many different children that are presenting different problems that are kind of fall under this umbrella of autism. Mm-hmm. But, to me, it makes more sense to look at exactly neurologically what's going on. And his two biggest issues are language delays as well as extreme sound sensitivity.
Okay. Now, sir, moving more, you were going to talk about your recent
Right. Okay. No, I've submitted over 100 FOIA requests to the CDC. And I've also been able to get some information from the CDC via congressional request. And the latest information basically showed that when children were exposed to thimerosal is the mercury-containing preservative that's used in vaccines and was used extensively in vaccines in the 1990s and early 2000s. But what I saw was that children that received thimerosal in their vaccines, they were essentially exposed to mercury. They were 7.6 times more likely to receive an autism diagnosis than children that did not receive mercury in their first month of life. Mm-hmm. Okay, and not only did we, I knew that of this finding. It was actually in a data table that was received via Freedom of Information Act back in 2005. But the thing that we recently discovered was that this was not just a little known fact. This was not just a number on the paper. The CDC wide knew, and it had been reported at an internal CDC conference, that not only were we seeing ultra high risks of autism when children were exposed to mercury in vaccines, but we were seeing in general neurological developmental disorders, speech and language delays, as well as what they termed the non-organic sleep disorder.
Well,
Okay.
Dr. Hooker, if I could just stop you for a moment to clarify, you're saying that the CDC was aware of the findings that you just mentioned to us there?
Absolutely, but there's been no move or no energy to ban mercury in vaccines. In fact, the CDC will say, oh, yes, we phased mercury out of vaccines in the early 2000s, but that's just simply not true. What they did was they took mercury out of several vaccines, the hepatitis B, the Haemophilus influenza, and the DTaP vaccine, but then they put it in the flu shot, which became a part of the infant schedule and was also recommended for pregnant women in any trimester. So pregnant women are actually exposed to 25 micrograms of mercury
Wow.
when they follow the CDC's recommendation and they get their flu shot.
Meanwhile, they're telling pregnant women to avoid mercury and other things, but you can have your mercury in your flu shot, which is very, very troubling. So let's just take a moment and clarify, what we're talking about here. So you're saying that vaccines, whether they be the shots that don't have them supposedly by the CDC or your flu shot, these things have mercury, thimerosal, and you're saying that this is, at least one of the causes or a potential cause of autism.
Right. In other information that I've uncovered, the CDC actually did a study on prenatal thimerosal exposure and autism risk. This study came out, it was done by a gentleman by the name of Christopher Price, and it was published in Pediatrics in 2010. And in that particular study, they said not only was thimerosal safe for pregnant women, is this mercury-containing preservative, but it was also preventative against autism. So they were saying that mercury was preventative against autism, and that that's a preposterous result. Mm-hmm. A neurotoxin like mercury does not prevent neurological issues from occurring. It just makes absolutely no sense. And so I got the background information. I wanted to reanalyze the Price study. And I have reanalyzed the Price study, and what I found and what the CDC actually knew in 2008, 2 years before, was that women that got the flu shot during pregnancy were 8.7 times more likely to have a child that regresses into autism spectrum disorder. And they buried that result. It was an out and out fraud. If you look at the background report that I was able to obtain via congressional request, and you see that information, it never saw the light of day. They simply ignored that particular number, and they used dubious statistics in order to dismiss the risk. Okay, but in fact, based on their own study and based on their own statistics and epidemiology, those infants that were exposed to thimerosal in utero are 8 times more likely to regress into autism.
That's very unfortunate, Doctor. Now we're talking about the vaccines affecting the children in the womb. Let's talk about the children outside the womb, because you get out of the womb, you have to go to school, you have to get several shots. And what does your research tell you from the kids who get the series of shots, whether they be the hepatitis B, whatever type of shots, the booster shots? What type of information do you have on that?
Well, essentially, what the CDC has found and what I've uncovered, this is, I want to be very specific because there are two analyses here. There are the CDC's analyses that they basically covered up, and then there's my reanalysis of their same data. I've been able for several studies to get the original data sets and reanalyze them using what I think are much more sound, much more fair epidemiology techniques. But even in the CDC's admission, boys that received the full amount of thimerosal or received, let's put it this way, higher levels of thimerosal in their infant shots are much more likely to have tics. And this is by the CDC's own admission. But, and yet it's still in flu shots. It's still the boys will receive a flu shot in their first 6 months of life, then another flu shot by the time they're 18 months of life. So that's 50 micrograms of mercury. But the CDC clearly has shown and has buried a result that boys that get the thimerosal are much more likely to get ticks. Now, when I took that data and reanalyzed it, okay, and I used methods that the CDC will use dubious methods, so they cut down the level of variability of thimerosal exposure between their cases and controls. When I reanalyzed it, what I saw was not only were individuals much more likely to get tics, but they were much more likely to be language delayed, speech delayed, and also have lower IQs.
Wow.
Okay, and these are children that didn't receive an autism diagnosis. These are children that we would call, in the autism community, neurotypical. But we're still seeing that, because of this exposure, we are dumbing down our children.
Exactly. Now, doctor, let me ask you this, because we're talking about this autism thing, and there are plenty of people out there watching right now. They say, hey, I've given my children shots, they have no symptoms. What would you say to parents who have that viewpoint?
Well, it's very interesting. In a statistical study, we want to get as many data points as possible. We want as much data as we can possibly get our hands on. So we need many. We evaluate many individuals. When I do a statistical study, I want to make sure that I have 10,000 controls. Now, if your child received infant vaccines that contained mercury or received other infant vaccines, and I'm not saying that mercury is the only problem. It is not. Mm-hmm. But if your child received all their shots and is not showing neurological issues, that's great. Okay, but statistically, we're seeing a much higher likelihood that they would have gotten those, and also that there are, and you also have to bear in mind that the neurological issues may appear over time. Okay, so a child that may appear perfectly normal that received mercury in their vaccines, well, you don't know what their trajectory would have been if they had not. Okay, but because we're seeing in general an overall lowering of the IQ. Okay, so first of all, you may think your child is fine, but you don't know how they would have performed if they had not received mercury in their shots. Okay, and number two, you can't look at an N of 1. You can't look at a statistical study. In my house, if I do a statistical study, then vaccines had an apparent cause to my son's neurological issues. Mm-hmm. Okay, when you do an actual study, we need to look on a population basis, and we need to be able to protect all children. Okay, not just those children that supposedly didn't react to their vaccines, but we're responsible for the entire society. And now we're seeing statistically significant, solid results that show that these vaccinations, especially those that contain mercury, are wreaking havoc to our children's neurological systems, as well as their immune systems.
Yeah, we saw Mrs. Boyle of the CDC. She was being grilled, and a gentleman asked her. He said, the children in Africa really didn't have any cases of autism before we started vaccinating them. Do you have any response to that? And she really did not. But while we're talking about the topic of autism, sir, you said it's different things, many different things, a cocktail of things. Are there anything else that people need to be aware of besides thimerosal?
I would say yes. I think that at this point, there are too many vaccines that children receive too young. If you look at the current vaccination schedule, children are receiving 49 different vaccinations by the time they reach age 6. That's just 49 individual needle sticks. Okay, many of those needle sticks are for multiple antigens. Like the MMR, it supposedly protects against measles, mumps, and rubella. But the CDC has never tested the safety of the vaccination schedule. The study that they refuse to do is the outcomes and the health effects of vaccinated versus unvaccinated children. And my contention is, if you have not done the study to show that these vaccines are safe, then there's no way that I'm going to put that in my body or my child's body. Okay?
Exactly.
So
those are very good points. No, please continue.
Otherwise, we're just a part of a grand experiment to see what happens. And quite frankly, I'm not going to put my family through a grand experiment.
Exactly. You don't want to just say, well, let's see what happens when you're dealing with something that could potentially damage yourself or your child. Now, doctor, our time is short. I just want to get your comments on some recent mainstream news articles. We have this one from CNN. Autism rates now 1 in 68 in U.S. children, reports the CDC.